Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's good to see everyone. Tonight we have Ken and Stan with us, and Dr. Ricks as always. So, welcome to episode 456 Understanding Resistance to the Judging of Others in Colossians 2:16 and 17. So, if everyone, or if Dr. Ricks, if you would start us out, that would be great.
When I was a kid, there was this girl in the back of the bus going to school, and she would read Dear Abby, and she made it so funny. So just getting back to the good old days, gonna read some old Dear Abby comments. Dear Abby, what can I do about all the sex, nudity, and foul language on my DVR? Dear Abby, I have a man. I can't trust him. He cheats so much. I'm not sure the baby I'm carrying is his. Dear Abby, I'm a 23-year-old, very, very liberated woman. And and so I'm paying a lot for birth control. It's getting expensive. I want my boyfriend. You think I should ask him to cover half of the expense of all the birth control pills and stuff? But the problem is, I don't know him well enough to discuss money.
Sad.
That's the world we live in, sad as it is.
That's true.
And this is one that I don't know why this one caught me, but it did. I was married to Bill for 3 months. And I thought I knew him, but I didn't really know him until one day he came home sober. Here's my favorite about giving advice. So, Dear Abby's giving this man advice, and the man says, my wife's been saying she wants a sports car on her 40th anniversary to renew her youth, just like guys do. And she's been saying that. And Dear Abby says, well, so what did you give her? I gave her a diamond ring. Dear Abby says, wait a minute. Why did you give her a diamond ring instead of a sports car? And he says, well, you can't give a fake car. You can't give a fake car.
Poor guy still hadn't figured it out.
Well, at any rate, by the way, this is one of the portions of the Bible that I think is most misunderstood. Colossians 2:16 and 17. As some young person told me, don't judge me. People love that expression, don't judge me. Well, do you know there are writers who, in commentaries, will say things like, these verses prove that no one can tell Christians what days to keep, what meat to eat, and what laws or anything. They can't tell them anything because it says, don't judge me. Now, do you really think that's what Paul meant? Well, if you take that approach, think about it. Aren't Paul's almost every single epistle of Paul has admonitions, letters of instructions, etc., and all of them? Paul certainly isn't afraid to tell them what's what, and even occasionally to the Corinthians, you all better behave because when I get there, well, anyway, you know how that book ends. So, so that is really not what he's saying in the Greek to them, and nobody can tell them anything. Don't let anybody judge you. Ken, let's read the scripture, and then we'll all discuss what it means.
Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body of Christ.
By the way, and the word is added by the translator. So if you leave that out, but the body of Christ. In other words, we believe, and it seems clear to me that Paul is saying only the body of Christ should judge you. You should ignore all these other critics out there. Don't let them judge you. Ignore them. Don't listen to them. But the church can make decisions about, all the things that we believe are appropriate for Christians. And that would make sense. Um, and I really believe that if you take the approach that nobody can tell a Christian to do anything, aren't you opening it up to being just a nothing religion?
It certainly appears that way to me that it would be. I mean, if the church had no authority whatsoever, what kind of religion would you have? It would just everybody would do their own thing, and it's sort of what is amalgamated today in our society among churches. If the church has no authority over anybody, then everybody just sort of does what they want to do, and everybody does what the Bible actually condemns, is does what's right in their own eyes. And I think Paul was probably dealing with some of this, and he saw it beginning to be a start in this new congregation here, and he felt the need to address it.
Yeah, it's like I've seen this on people who watch churches decline. At least in the world, the biggest churches that decline are the ones that are so liberated that anybody can believe anything they want, teach anything they want. They stand for nothing. And actually, the people kind of feel like, well, why bother to go? Their attendance is dropping faster than the few that do at least stand for what they think is right.
This church here that he is writing to, Colossae, they think that, it was written while Paul was in Rome, imprisoned in Rome, and it had a lot of similarities between the letter that he wrote to the Ephesian church, as well as the Laodicean church, which we don't have the copy of that letter. But they believe that Paul, and you can sort of see that in the writing of the book of Colossians, that he actually never met these people. This was a church group that was started by another gentleman, Epaphras, I believe was his name, and they came to, I think it was Senecus that came to Paul and was telling him about the problems that were happening in this church. And you think about the Apostle Paul, all the things he had seen in his ministry, that he had, he even wrote about how the Jews had attacked him from every angle. He said, I even once had to be let down in a wall in a basket, for pity's sake. But he realized that when something like this began to crop up in a church, it was going to be destruction of that group. And he felt the need, especially for that brand new congregation and people that he had never met, to try to address it in this letter.
Yeah, and don't let the outside world pull you. By the way, Paul, maybe almost about 3 years, he taught from a auditorium, which assuming he had big seating every day, and he taught, and one of his major disciples, but maybe others helped too, they created a bunch of churches that are on that mail route from Ephesus that is talked about in the book of Revelation. At least 3 churches are mentioned by Paul, having been started by Paul's disciples, but not by Paul himself. Right. But if Paul was at Ephesus for 3 years or close to it, they had to learn a lot from Paul. And I know we know that he wrote one to the other church that had never seen him personally. It was Laodicea. And he tells them to read his letters, and he said that he sends them to the other churches. Like, so this letter would have been read in Laodicea and other places. But it's like Paul, it's sort of like a grandparent. Paul feels that this church, even though it was started by one of his disciples, is his church too.
That's exactly. He felt like sort of like overseer.
Yeah. And he doesn't want them to be influenced by wrong directions. Uh, so let's look a little bit at the context of Galatians 2, 16. Let's look at Galatians 2:15.
So Colossians, right?
I mean Colossians 2:15. Did I say
Okay.
Galatians?
And
I meant Colossians.
I was about to change my Bible.
and having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a shoe of them openly, triumphing over them in it.
I think he's saying in part because Christ was victorious, at the cross and the stake, he has the power to lead the church, and don't worry about the world judging you because of what he did. So, with that in mind, let's go on and read the next quotation that kind of picks up that context for a minute, Ken.
Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, and he is the head of the body of the church? Who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead? And then 1 Corinthians 12:27, you have that here.
Okay. Yeah. In 1 Corinthians 12:27 says, you, meaning the church, you're the body of Christ and members in particular. So what he's just saying is the only one that you should be concerned about getting instructions from is the church. Don't listen to all the world around you. Oh, and by the way, let me just make a comment here. Let's celebrate the spiritual victory of Terry Gooch. People might ask, when you know people and they pass away, are you sure they're in God's kingdom? I'm 100% sure. I talked to Terry shortly before he went to sleep, I guess, and slept the last couple of days before he passed away. Believe me, Terry was in a great spirit. He's in God's kingdom. He lived a great life. He was loving and strong and really helped the church in Branson and then Springfield, and really was just helpful all the way around. So anyway, I just want to mention that we're going to celebrate Terry Gooch. And I know the negative side of anybody passing is the people left behind. So I do understand that. But it's a victory for Terry. That's what I'm saying.
Certainly is. And I agree wholeheartedly. And the things I were thinking about today were that, he has gotten the victory over life. That's the very next moment of his consciousness will be in God's kingdom. And that is, I'm a little bit envious of that thought that he's made it and he's crossed the finish line. And I'm very happy for him in that regard, but sure we'll miss him, and our prayers go out to his family, certainly do.
Yeah, that's what Ted Cotton used to always say when we had to go to a funeral or something like that. He said, I envy that person in that grave. They're going to be there. He says, I envy them. He said, they've already done it. They don't have to see what we're going to have to see. Of course, he didn't make it, as long as we have, but still, and I envy Ted because, like you say, that envy is, the man is going to be there. He's going to be there. And my own mom and several others has passed and gone. They're going to be there. And I can't think of anything I look forward to seeing them again. Any better than that, just seeing them again in God's kingdom. So
absolutely.
And like Paul was writing, Christ had a great victory, and that's why, of course, he was resurrected, and he sent the Holy Spirit back to empower the church, and so he's with us and helping us, and he's the one whose advice we should take. By the way, this letter was written in 62 or 63 AD, so it's 32 years after Christ's resurrection. So the question is, what has the church been doing all those 30-some years? They've been keeping no holy days, nothing. I mean, some people would give you that impression. They don't believe in anything. You can do anything you want. By the way, think about the practicality of trying to run a church like that. But I mean, I know people want that. So then they say, well, then we can just add anything in that we like.
Especially after following the original Jesus Christ and the original disciples, and and following their example and the call that the Apostle Paul had. I had the thought tonight, when did the day of Pentecost occur? It was after the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And here was one of the greatest holy days in the New Testament church, was the day of Pentecost. And it happened after Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. And yet here they were all in Jerusalem celebrating this holy day. And if that would have been done away with by something that Jesus did, they certainly wouldn't have celebrated it. And it wouldn't have been such a rewarding experience for the church for, that many people to be converted if it was against God's will to continue observing the holy days. And of course, I made my whole list again in my mind of all the references Paul made of the holy days throughout his writings, including, Pentecost and the days of unleavened bread and the fast. He mentions the fast and others. One time he says, I must by all means keep this feast, which comes at Jerusalem. So the repeated and references that he made years after Christ died of teaching and preaching in the synagogues on his Sabbath day, as it was his habit, or his custom was, as it says that he went there and preached. And not only that, but in every place that he went and on every one of his journeys, missionary trips that he took, he mentions keeping the Sabbath day and going into like to Ephesus and Miletus and other places where he mentions he went in and preached on the Sabbath day. And one event, it was three weeks or something like that. He preached on the Sabbath day. So the idea that those were done away is ridiculous. But anyway, right. That's my comment.
And it's just, and by the way, when did the Ten Commandments be given, and God, Moses went to the top of the mountain to meet God, all in a way face to face? Pentecost.
On the very day.
Yeah.
How significant is it?
Yeah. So all the stuff that's in the Old Testament or in the Bible, God reinforced it. And I believe this could be obviously doesn't have to be true, but probably the second coming of Christ will coincide with something that's in the Old Testament. You wait and see. When it happens, everybody's going to be shocked when they look back. What? I would have never guessed that. I'm not saying other possibilities, but you wait and see. God seems to do things methodically, even if we don't see it until the last minute or afterwards.
Right. I saw a few articles this week of the meteor shower, the Illinois meteor shower, and how bad it was back in the 1800s. And they're talking about the end of the world. And they said, these people were thinking that this is going to be the end of the world. I was just shaking my head. I said, where are y'all getting this from? And then, I said, it's not going to be the end of the world. Your house might get hit by a meteorite, but you're not going to die because of it. But, back to Paul again. What strikes me the most out of all Paul's writings, and I love it, when he got struck down at the road of Damascus, Paul was the Pharisee of the Pharisees. He knew the law better than anybody that we could tell. He was a doctor of the law. And then when Christ struck him down, at that point in time, did Paul change any of the laws? Did Paul stop keeping the Sabbath day? Did Paul stop keeping the holy days? No, he did not. And we read through it, but for some reason the whole world thinks he was able to do away with it. He did not. And so that's where a lot of people get their confusion from.
One of the arguments that Paul made there, even in the Jerusalem conference, was that he understood that that circumcision was a covenant that was made with the nation of Israel and not the Gentiles. But he also made the comment, and they made the decision there at the Jerusalem conference to only send these Gentiles those 4 items. And it was about, abstaining from idols and, not, dealing with blood and fornication and the like. but things sacrificed to idols and blood or whatever it was. I can't remember the four out off the top of my head, but he goes on to say that Moses is taught. He said throughout all the nations are these synagogues where Moses is taught every Sabbath day. He made that comment that they would eventually learn all of these other principles and laws of God through the teachings of in these synagogues that was being held on the Sabbath day. And that was late, in Paul's ministry, or later in Paul's ministry when the Jerusalem conference came about.
One thing to remember too, the Judaizer party, or Pharisees who believed that, some of them weren't probably as bad as others, but they said, wait a minute, before we can really let you into this church, you got to get circumcised. And really, they said, we can make an exception about circumcision for Gentiles. All they need to do is agree, stop doing the things that offend Jewish people, which is like bringing blood pudding to a potluck, or mixing sex and religion, because they did, and probably some other bad stuff, but you know what I mean, which would offend Jews right away. And just tell them, stop doing that. Like you said, Stan, they'll learn the rest week by week on the Sabbath. But people read the Bible, but they don't get the context.
We're going to see here in this book of Colossians too, that it was probably a certain individual that was bringing about these doctrines. And did we even read that verse there where it said, let no man therefore judge you in meat and drink, and in respect of a holy day and a new moon and of the Sabbath? Did we read that? I didn't remember if we read that.
I think we read that Colossians 2:16.
Yes.
That no man. Yeah, there could have been a man. I mean, he may have had a few associates maybe who was pushing that idea.
Well, look down just briefly here. I want to finish that down in verse 18. I won't get ahead of myself here, but because you have this referenced in one of your notes. He says at the end of verse 18, intruding into those things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind. It's almost as if there was one individual, some teacher, that was introducing these ideas into that new church. And Paul knew he was a bad guy. He was bringing in false doctrines and things we'll see here in a moment in some of the other scriptures that you have listed. But he was probably the culprit that was bringing in these things into that church, and Paul was trying to nip it in the bud.
And it would make sense if he was saying, look, the reason your neighbors don't like you or whatever they were doing is because, and then he could, a clever guy could rattle off other kinds of additional thought. And we would just, whatever he would say. By the way, I think there's three possibilities. I can't see any other possible ways to do it. Three possibilities about them keeping the Sabbath, etc. It would be annual Sabbaths and meat, clean meats and that sort of thing. So let's look at the three possibilities. The first and most likely one was that they were keeping the Sabbaths, holy days, laws of clean meats, and using the Hebrew calendar like we do, or at least most of us listening to this program probably do. Paul penned this letter to the congregation because he knew they were doing all these things and they were being criticized by the world around them. And like you say, there may have been even some insiders making it worse. Because sometimes insiders can make things worse than they otherwise would be. I even think that's true of certain political parties. There's so much backstabbing that probably makes things worse. My opinion, but we'll see about that. But he's saying don't let this ascetic culture that the Greeks have, which is asceticism, which is abusing the body, giving up good things like meat, sex, and using self-flagellation, because that's what they did. And you'll see that Paul mentioning things about that in other letters, like celibate priesthood and other things. And in an ascetic culture, feasting and celebrating would offend their ascetic nature. I mean, ascetic neighbors.
You know, when you look at the book of Colossians and you read it as if it were a letter addressed to you, and you realize you put yourself in that ascetic environment, you know, the first thing that came to my mind, and Paul, in the very beginning of this book of Colossians here, he begins to tick off the things that Jesus has done, the accomplishments that he has done for us, up to and including his death on the stake. And basically what he is saying here, and I wrote in my notes here, I can hear this guy in his mind, this interloper saying, you know, Christ is not enough. You have to do all of these things. You have to have, you know, like you said, be celibate, be a vegetarian, eat meat, or, you know, you can't eat certain things. You can't drink alcohol. You have this severe self-discipline, and then maybe you'll be good enough to get into God's kingdom. And Paul's big argument here, and I think the whole theme of the book is Christ is good enough to accomplish all of these things in your life. And he is the head, like you mentioned here. He's the head of the church. And I believe that he's trying to drive that point home with him. You don't need all of these other things to bring about salvation.
Let me ask you a question. Before I left my job, I know the last 5 or 6 years, the faculty was changed. We had more and more vegetarians, to the point where when we planned these meetings with luncheons and all the details, but it got to the point where they made some of us feel guilty for liking meat. And I know you're kidding me. And then sometimes, just to make people feel good, we'd have some kind of way to have certain kinds of noodles instead of meat for lunch. I mean, I didn't complain because I'm the guy that didn't want them to ever use pork, which took out a lot of their pizza ideas, my not wanting pork and pepperoni. So I wouldn't complain much. But have any of you experienced being around a bunch of vegetarians who feel holier than thou?
No, because that wouldn't work around me. Actually, we had one at work. We have one at work, and he's I do it because of the animals and the cruelty to animals. I said, "What's your belt made out of?" Leather. I said, "What's your shoes made out of?" He said, "Shut up." I said, "Okay, maybe you should shut up because you're a hypocrite."
You know, the funny thing about it, if you look at the world and you drive through the countryside, where there are plenty of cows. I mean, for a cow, most of them living a great cow's life. They're protected by the farmer, and they can munch. And I'm sure there's some predators around, but, you know, with the dogs and the farmers and the guns and the fences, they're pretty much safe. And they, you know, and then one day they put them in a truck and they go somewhere, wham, they kill them so quick they might even happen. Yeah. I'm not saying it could not be tough for some animals, but most farm animals, their numbers wouldn't exist as in the numbers they have if they were out in the wild. And people think, well, out in the wild is good. No, it isn't. For most animals, it's dog eat dog.
It's exactly right.
Really.
Right,
you go out in the forest, it's dog eat dog out there.
The whole of nature is that way. They're feeding. There's always something feeding on something else.
The beef that I have in my freezer was treated excellent right across the street up until the day it died. It was treated well, fed well, nice open area. I could wave at it when I went by, but it tastes really good.
Yeah, did you name it?
Oh, I don't name my food, man.
No.
I know. That's what I say. Don't name
I know
food.
there's some exceptions, some problems, but for the most part, many of these animals would not exist in the numbers they are living relatively comfortable life. Maybe I guess you can make an argument for chickens, but if they were in the wild, they'd be running from wolf packs, coyotes, chicken hawks. And in most cases, they are protected from most of that.
There's no such thing as a wild chicken. Have you ever
Yeah,
seen?
that's true.
There's no chickens in the wild.
That's true.
Right.
They wouldn't exist long.
They wouldn't exist at all. I mean,
You know, I hunt and I see this, you know, firsthand. I see it happening all the time. I see the hawks eating the squirrels and all this thing. I see it all the time. And I see a deer run by me so fast because the dog's trying to chase it down, or a coyote or something. And you know, so I see it firsthand exactly what goes on in the wild. I know exactly what happened. And it is, you know, it's survival is the fittest, and you know, they have to be, I guess everywhere you have to do the same thing. You have to be able to be fit to be able to survive.
And I believe because it's in Noah, the book of Noah, about clean animals, 7 pairs. You know, they keep saying in all the Noah movies, 2 pairs of every animal, but that's not accurate. There were 7 pairs of the clean because they were food and they had economic value for the human beings. It is probable that right from the very beginning, people protected the herd animals like cows and chickens and sheep. And doesn't that make sense?
of course.
So they didn't have to compete against, you know, all the wild predators the same way other animals did. I mean, that seems logical to me, right from the beginning, or somewhere close to the beginning.
And when you think about it, most of those herd animals are practically defenseless. You know, they don't. They're not like a lion. I mean, I guess a big bull has a little bit of defense against him, but it's like the buffalo. You know, the you know, even water buffalo. When the lions circle, the only strength they have in defense is in the fact that they're so huge in numbers.
The meanest animal on the planet's a water buffalo. Ever seen them go after something? Water buffaloes are the toughest, meanest, most brutal animals you ever did see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they survive, but they're kind of the exception. But even buffalo, their young are hunted by the weak ones, and the slow ones, the dumb ones, are hunted by the lion prides.
Yeah.
And they say I read this somewhere, if you go to Alaska, the most dangerous thing in Alaska is a wolf pack. Alaskan wolves are big, smart, and they can even bring down one of those big bears.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it isn't a battle, but they're the most. So almost you think of elks and all those big animals that can't think of those other big animals that are in Alaska, but they have to run for their lives against wolf packs.
Oh yeah.
Anyway,
there's a
I know
moral
we should
lesson
jump
in
on
that.
vegetarians. They mean well, but you see the point that I think Paul is making.
Yeah, what Stan described a few minutes ago, I was going to say, it almost sounded from what this person that may have been the one causing all this trouble was the beginning of the Catholic or the whatever style of church, you know, the Sunday keeping church we have today. It almost sounds like the beginnings of that.
Well, I've heard it described as the beginnings or the early stages of the Gnostics.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
And that certainly could be seen. A point could be made that was the possibility. And and we got way sidetracked here on the animals, but you mentioned in your notes, Dr. Ricks, and I don't want to get ahead of you either, but back in verse 8 there, where he talks about the philosophy and the rudiments of this world, the traditions of men, the rudiments of this world that are not of Christ. So it was lies that the man was telling. And Paul saw right through it. And he is going straight to the source, and he's warning this people, this new group, these new Christians, not to be cheated out of their salvation, their reward, their blessing, their spiritual blessing that Christ had given them. And they had full right and title to it. Don't let this guy steal that from you. And I can just almost see Paul's concern there in prison for this fledgling little group that he can't get to. He's never met. He can't go see them personally. And he's writing as best he can to give them the words to defend them against this perpetrator.
And just a few lines from verse 16, 17, just 2 or 3 lines down. Let's go to Colossians 2:20, Ken, and you can see clearly he's fighting worldly ascetic philosophy.
Wherefore, if ye be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances? And there's some stuff in touch not, taste not, handle not, which all are to perish with the using, after the commandments and doctrines of men, which things have indeed a shew of wisdom in will, worship, and humanity, wisdom and will, worship, and humility, and neglecting of the body, not in any honor, to the satisfying of the flesh.
And can you see how that can make someone self-righteous? I gave up this, I gave up that. But Paul really is telling you that it really does not make you grow spiritually. And they probably could see the Colossians feasting on one of the holy days and drinking wine and enjoying themselves while they were surrounded by a bunch of ascetics who many of them probably wouldn't touch meat or wine, or they didn't want to celebrate. They thought, I call it the monkism. You know what I mean by monkism? You see now those monasteries, and the monks give up everything fun in life, and they go around looking pious. And it's just self-righteousness. And by the way, in all fairness to monks, because you might meet a few, I've seen 1 or 2 around here, I'm sure they're brainwashed and they're misled and all that. So I'm not saying but it's wrong. It's worldly.
How sad it is. I mean, around the world, there have been people who have not spoken their whole lives, or they've done religious things that have been, on a par with abuse, of living and wasting a whole life and not being able to enjoy a life that we were given because of this kind of teaching. And I go back to verse 18 where he says, voluntary humility, acting like you're humble, and worshiping of angels, intruding into those things which he has not seen. So in other words, he's standing up and saying that God told him that he has seen this vision, and therefore everybody needs to follow this example here, or this teaching here, and he's misled everybody in that, or trying to mislead everybody in that congregation, and it's rather sad that still happens today.
So we can see the option number 1, that they were keeping these days, and they're being judged and criticized for doing it, is the most likely possibility. But let's look at a second possibility. Possibility number 2, that they were not keeping the Sabbaths, annual Sabbaths, etc., when Paul penned this letter to these Gentiles. This would mean that the disciples of Paul, who had been with him in Ephesus for over 2 years, near 3 years, did not learn to keep these biblical items. It didn't pass that truth on to them. I remember the Old Testament was the only Bible that existed. So that does not seem likely, but let's just presume that's the case. Think about it. How could whoever their critic is, and how could their neighbors judge them or criticize them on something they're not doing? Now think about it. If they're not keeping the Sabbath, and they're not keeping the holy days, and they're not feasting, etc., how could their pagan neighbors judge them or criticize them?
They're not even drawing attention to themselves.
Exactly. They fit in perfect. I never noticed them. They don't do anything different than anybody else in this pagan society does, right?
So why all of the stir? Why all the turmoil? Why the letter? Why the argument? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, why tell them, resist the pagan philosophies around you if you're not resisting the pagan philosophies around you, or at least you appear to public you don't believe in anything, which would be fine with them because they had many
Yeah.
different pagan gods. You don't stand for anything. Well, that's fine. We like that kind of thing. I'd almost argue, I'll ask Ken what he thinks. If we fit into this world too well, doesn't that make you suspicious? If nobody in this world ever felt odd about our religious practices.
I guess, yeah, I would see that. I mean, we should stand out for something. I know my same days, my same vacation days off every year are similar, and my don't eat pork and all that, and they don't catch me cussing at work. I mean, it's extremely rare if they hear something out of me, and then everybody freezes. If they do hear something out of me, uh-oh, what did you do? But yeah, I mean, we do. I'm sure we do.
I remember when Worldwide apostatized, and they got praised by people in the general Hollywood community, and they praised them. And at that point, I knew they were on the wrong track. When the world, I mean, the paganized Hollywood establishment out there in Pasadena, Hollywood, starts praising you, you should be worried.
No doubt.
The Bible says, "Woe unto you when men speak well of you."
Right.
And you think about the examples in the Bible, where not only the Apostle Paul said, "I'll come to you with a rod." You want me to come to you with love or with a rod? And John the Baptist called them, "You generation of vipers." He stood up to the Pharisees, and of course Jesus going in and turning over the tables in the temple. All of those were not subtle acts to be unnoticed. They were really making themselves noticed by the general public.
Yeah, and calling their religious leaders snakes in the grass.
Exactly.
Christ was quite bold, and well, that's how those things go sometimes. But it was, and I just say, and I know people say, but they call your religion a cult. That actually could be a positive badge to not be acceptable. Not that we're bad guys, I don't mean that, but not to be fully acceptable by the mainstream world.
The majority is not always right.
Amen.
Rarely is
so
it.
True. And as we said, if they weren't keeping any of that stuff when they got the letter, why in the world would Paul tell them, don't let people judge you on this if they're not doing it?
Oh, good.
I guess we can pass over Colossians 2:8-9, since you mentioned already, Ken, where it said, don't let people spoil you through philosophy. But that's really what he was worried about, worldly philosophy, not the Old Testament, not the Bible. Let's look at possibility number 3. This is the one that will get the most attention by the world. And see if I can explain it well. Possibility number 3 is that his comments were aimed at a Judaizer threat. If he believes they were not keeping the Sabbaths and holy days, etc., when Paul wrote them, and the Judaizers were the major threat, and they were criticizing this church for not keeping the Sabbath and annual Sabbath. Now, that's how most of the world wants to look at it. You're going to say, but why isn't that likely to be true? Here's why it's not likely to be true. What was the goal of the Judaizers? The goal of the Judaizers was to make Sabbath keeping stricter, more binding. That's depending on whose book you look at. There are at least 620 Sabbath laws and rules and regulations. Well, if they weren't keeping the Sabbath at all or nothing, why would the Judaizers even bother with them? How could you ask people, I want tighter regulations on your Sabbaths if you're not keeping the Sabbath?
Exactly. You know, it one of the commentaries that I read on this subject made the point that this young fledgling group that was a part of the true church was receiving was being judged not just by the Judaizers, but also by the the other churches, but also, I mean, maybe the false churches that were out there, but also by the pagans themselves, because they were so different, so strange from what everybody else was doing and what was accepted in society. So they may have been being judged by all three groups, and Paul was telling them to to the stick to the head of the church. He's the one that can bring you through all of this. And anyway, I thought it was a good point.
That's a good point. Ignore the world. And if the Judaizers were a factor, they were probably the secondary factor. Because you look at most of Colossians, the book, the majority of the comments are about worldly philosophy, asceticism, a lot of which we mentioned all over chapter 2, but even in the rest of the book. But the Judaizers could have been a secondary threat, which means they were keeping the Sabbath. And here's how it probably appeared to the outside world. Well, we know, because there's some Jewish people here and there. We know there's some Jewish people that keep these things, but you all are mostly Gentiles. Maybe they would have been all Gentiles. You're Greeks, and maybe a few other nationalities, but you're Greeks. What are you doing keeping the Sabbath and feasting on all this meat and drinking wine and whatever else they complained about? You shouldn't be doing this. It looks bad. What Paul is saying, let none of them judge you. Ignore all of them. But that would even include the Judaizers who were saying, you're not strict enough. You're not over-regulating it like we do the rest of the Jewish people. And I know the Judaizers is in itself a big topic. But one thing that I want to mention, everybody, including the Judaizers, would have agreed the Sabbath was not just a minor doctrine. It was the sign that told people which God you worshiped. Ken, could you go to Exodus 31:13?
Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you.
So let's assume for a minute the Judaizers were maybe a secondary factor, or a few of them maybe, and they were keeping the Sabbath. Their goal would have been to try to get them in a more stricter, over-regulated Sabbath keeping, like they did for most of the Jewish people. That would have been their goal. But that means they had to have been keeping the Sabbath and holy days, right? Or what would the Judaizers be talking to them about, right? If they said, hey, it's been 30 years and the church has never kept this Sabbath and all that other stuff, what are you talking about? The Judaizers would have said, well, you all have just gone pagan, right? We want anything to do with you. There's just a bunch of pagans. And that's what you're using the sun god and not the sign of the God. By the way, the Sabbath is a sign of the Creator God, because not only did He create the world, but by resting, He created the day of rest.
And that was one of the points of, I believe it was the Gnostics, was that there was no, creator, ultimate creator God of the universe, and to set that aside, it was something that they were having to deal with and address as well.
Yeah, secret knowledge, Gnosticism, special knowledge. But the point is, doesn't that sound like today's world in a way?
You took the words right out of my mouth. Oh, I was waiting for the right time to say it. I was going to say, does this not feel like some of the things that we deal with in the Church of God. I mean, modern Christianity doesn't accept us because we keep the Sabbath day. I guess if you looked around the world, the pagans think we're weird because we appear to be somewhat Jewish, because I've heard people ask me, and I know you have too, are you Jewish? So you're not a Jew. So you're not, you're not in a modern day definition of a Christian because you don't keep Christmas and Easter. You guys are weird. You're an oddball. You're an outcast. You certainly don't fit into all the, the cubby holes that we have for religion.
We don't fit into any of the buckets that they are familiar with.
But here's what I found that's most interesting to me was that, I mean, when I first came into the church and I gave up Christmas and Easter and I started keeping the Sabbath day, when I was hunting just a week before, if you will, and or a little bit before that, before I got baptized. But, and I've been in the church quite a long time, but what is so fascinating is after a period of time, after some years, it takes a little while. First you'll notice that your family starts dying off on, not dying off, but when letting up on you a little bit, and that you don't have to explain yourself. That they probably are thinking, like you say, Stan, that they're weird. But after a little time, it's not as hard on me as a person to do, God's law as it was when I first came into the church in the first 5 or 6 years. It took some period of time. And then, my friends and everybody I worked with at the time and all that, things starting to ease up. You still have to ask, you still have to answer their questions at Christmas time and stuff like that, which is easy to do. But after a period of time, it seems like it eases up, or maybe we harden. Maybe we harden up a little bit. And I don't know which way it works, but it just seems like it has after a period of time.
Do you mind if I ask you, Ken, a follow-up question? Since all of us will get some level of criticism eventually, what's your advice, maybe the others can say it, on how we can best answer questions about, why don't you keep Christmas? What's wrong with you?
Are you talking to me or Ken?
Yes, Ken.
Which Ken?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Okay. Jeremiah 10. Jeremiah 10 is easy. I mean, that's an easy one. I tell them to read it for yourself and tell me what it's talking about. Well, they don't worship it. Okay. Well, you got it in your room. You got it in your house. That's an easy one. Easter, I said that's an abomination to God. And that's an abomination to Christ. It's pretty simple, and I've said, the same arguments that we always do. 3 days, 3 nights, how do you figure? Some of the other ones are a little bit more difficult to explain to people, but it's, when you start pulling out the Bible scriptures to them and you start telling them just look it up for themselves, they say, well, I know what it says, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so, at that point in time, you can't continue on with these people. You just have to say, I'm just telling you what it says, and that's what we believe in.
The other Ken, any thoughts on how best to answer critics?
I don't get many critics. I mean, when I first got into church, the only really critics I had was my parents. Occasionally, one of my uncles or basically just a couple of uncles who were critics at the time. I just ignore them. They have no standing for their position, so I don't get much. HR everybody's afraid of HR, so they don't bother me at work. Never have about so that I've never really had any. Questions. I just tell them I don't eat pork, and that seems to be almost the normal thing nowadays.
Interesting, Ken. When you hear people talk about foreign countries, Christians, especially Christians like ours, get a lot of persecution and criticism in foreign countries. America still has, now we may not have it for long, we still have freedom of religion, that people will only go so far in criticizing you. It's interesting, this is a black lady, and she said, well, why aren't you eating pork? Are you Muslim? because that's what they would have expected. She's from St. Louis. That's what she would have expected. And when I said no, she's like shocked. What? You're a Christian? I don't understand it. But still, nothing came of it. There's only so much they can do in America. They can maybe look at you strange, but we still have freedom of religion. Now, there are people who are saying our current government will start persecuting people who believe in the Bible too much. I guess we'll have to wait and see if that happens. Hopefully, we'll have years before our government gets that bold. But there are people in America who don't want freedom of religion if it gets too biblical and you start teaching things like real yeses and nos.
I listened to an interview here not too long ago of a man, and I can't recall his name, but he wrote this book and he blames all the wars. And he also made this statement that the worst thing that happened to the United States was religion. He blamed all the wars that we've ever had on religion, and not only religion, but the Christian religion. Because if we weren't defending these ideals, then we wouldn't have gone to war to defend them. And he really lays it at the door of Christianity. And when he got through with his speech, it was a standing ovation.
What?
A big crowd of people that were listening to his speech about the reason that, that religion is the Christian religion was the fault of, or the greatest fault of our country. I was astounded.
How many years ago was that?
I was thinking maybe 4 or 5 years ago that I saw this program. It was pretty recent. Recent, but
they've really.
I'd have to look it up. But it was quite striking. I mean, it really made an impression on me. I couldn't believe that the people were applauding him after it was over with.
Could we skip Ken to Matthew 11:28?
Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light.
The point I want to bring that is that that's what Christ taught his disciples, and that's what they would have taught the churches, and the disciples of the disciples would have taught. The Judaizers wanted to put a yoke of bondage, just like Christ was criticizing the Jewish world in his day. But they couldn't have put a bondage of making the Sabbath more binding and in a painful way if the church wasn't keeping it at all and hadn't been keeping it for 30 years. You see how ridiculous that would have been? So they had to have been keeping the Sabbath. So option number 3 doesn't really pay off. And just to add to that, let's go to Mark 2:24, 2:28, and see that Christ did not believe in the burdensome approach that the Judaizers and much of Judaism had in his day.
And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said to them, Have ye never read what David did when he had need and hungered, he and they that were with him, how they went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath.
So remember, the Sabbath is a feast day. Don't let any of our pagan, agnostic, pagan neighbors get to you. Or super religious people try to make the Sabbath binding in a way where you don't enjoy it, because it's meant as a day of rest and a feast day. Absolutely. Eating good food is a good thing. You could tell I like that, right?
Well, I think you made the point that it's an extreme, like the Judaizers, it's an extreme level of keeping the Sabbath day. It's an extreme. It's always the extreme with them. Everything. It was burdensome for the people in Jesus' day, and he tried to make them realize that the Sabbath was never intended to be such a burden on the people, and just the idea that he would even think about relaxing that made them furious.
Yeah. And when he said Christ is Lord of the Sabbath, I mean, he decides what Sabbath regulations are. And basically, as far as the Judaizers were concerned, what the apostles had taught the Colossians was to enjoy the Sabbath, but they wanted them to be stricter. When they say things like all the laws, you'll think, does that mean the church is lawless? No, they meant every single Jewish regulation. See, what the Jews did, and there's a book called the Mishnah. I'm probably not getting all the details at this point, but they would build rules around the laws around the laws around the law, so nobody could ever break the law, and they'd be super righteous and super self-righteous. And I guess they meant well, and it sounds good. It just didn't work.
Yeah, I think I have a book here that had the 615 laws, out of which that began with the 10 Commandments, but they people would ask, well, they would ask normal questions about how do I, is it okay for me to walk a certain distance on the Sabbath day? Or is it okay for me to, go get my cow out of the ditch? And they found ways, to write these additional comments about this, the specifics of those 10 commandments, and they became more specific and more specific and more specific until it got to the point where no one could even, do certain things like mash a bug on the Sabbath day. And that sounds ridiculous, but it got to that point to where people were just imprisoned by all the rules and regulations regarding the commandments.
We might do a program on this. It's a big topic. People will go to the Old Testament, find something that in the modern world you can't apply. Then they'll say, oh, the Bible is extreme. I think what people don't know, everything in the Bible is good and was given by a righteous God. We have to understand it. See, Paul understood it. He understood the spirit behind it, the meat. Like when he said, don't muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. Yeah, he said, really, the principle behind that is not so much for the farm animal. It applied to them too, of course, but it means you should pay salaries to the people that do a lot of work for you, and pay your workers, what they're due and when they're due, whatever. And a whole bunch. The problem a lot of people have with the Bible is they don't understand what God intended. And if they understood it, they'd see, and I'm not saying that's always an easy thing to do, they would understand how to apply it in the modern world. And so they wonder one extreme or the other, oh, everything's done away, or try to be crazy about it. I think it's just a matter of people like Paul. He was an expert. And especially after Christ kind of broke him down and converted him and trained him, he really understood it. And our problem with people who criticize the Bible today is they don't really understand God. They just think they do.
Can you imagine if God had written 9,000 commandments? Just think about it. Can you imagine? I love the simplicity of the 10 Commandments and the way he wrote it, and he kept it simple, and he kept it broad in its scope, but yet simple. If it were an encyclopedia full of laws, we would spend our lives trying to understand it, number one, and we would never be free to do anything because we would always feel as though we were continually breaking some law.
Just like our justice system.
Exactly.
Yes. It's like the tax laws. They claim that the laws are so complicated, no one fully understands them.
And no one fully obeys all the time.
And like they're prosecuting some guy because he got fringe benefits from his employer, I guess tax sheltered like a car rental and a car parking space. I mean, that is so pharisaical. Of course, they're doing it for political motives. I understand that it's evil and politically motivated. But you see how when laws are so complex, you can, what is a statement? You can prosecute a ham sandwich if you're mean enough.
Well, no, yeah, I mean everybody in this country is breaking laws every day. They're all criminals. They just don't know it. You got to dig far enough, you'll find something that anybody has done. You'll find it on anybody, and
how many people drive 45 miles an hour?
Yeah, nobody, including the police that pass me, and I'm going 20 over.
Yeah. Well, like you get a company car. Are you sure you didn't use that company car to go to the grocery store on your way home when you could have gone home straight and then walked to the grocery store? Well, isn't that being picky?
Yeah. Or did you file a company car as income on your income tax?
Right.
You know, I mean, I've heard that brought up in recently in the news about whether if you've been given a company car, did you consider that to be income? You know, and put it on your tax.
You get taxed.
A little bit ridiculous.
Where I work, they tax you, and then on your usage. So.
Yeah.
Maybe that helps make it easier. Or like if you are a waiter, a lot of waiters can get really good tips. And I know the government has a thumb scale taxes off tips, but you could argue, are you accurately reporting the full benefits of especially generous tippers to the IRS? You see how overregulation just creates a mess, and it's a record-keeping nightmare as well.
Well, the Germans were really good at keeping records about all of that, you know, in World War II. They were fanatics about keeping records of everything, but it's a good point.
Overregulation, one of the reasons we have inflation is overregulation slows down an economy, makes people less prosperous. It's bad. But in the religious world, it's also bad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I know we're at the end. The undeniable answer is obviously they were keeping the Sabbath and holy days and had been for the 30 years since Christ was dead. And Paul was saying with that letter, don't let the critics get to you. And we could, I'll just mention Colossians 2:7, because that's right before what he wrote. He said, based on things that have been taught. So he did teach them things. They weren't just told, do anything you want. And I think we've talked about all the evidence of what the church did to keep holy days. It's just all over the book of Acts. So it's clear that when people look at that scripture and say, see, it's bad for you to keep Sabbaths, they just never thought it through. And why would Paul write to them if they weren't keeping it? Why would he tell them?
Well, you know, you mentioned earlier here what evidence would you give, or how would you describe to people? And I wanted to say that one of the things that I usually do is tell people about the early New Testament church and what happened to the early New Testament church and how it sort of went underground, and what emerged in the 3rd and 4th century didn't look anything like the original church that Jesus and the disciples kept. But also the next thing that I try to point out to people is look at the prophecies about the millennial reign of Christ and how he's going to establish the law and keep the holy days in the future. And if they were done away, then why would he bother with reinstating them in the millennium if they weren't always? God says that he never changes. So it only makes sense that they would be existent even during Paul's day as well.
And as we said, why judge people? How can they be judged on something they're not doing? The final scripture, let's read 1 Corinthians 5, 7, and 8, and then we'll end the program.
All right. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth.
And if as one commentary admitted it, they said, when it says keep the feast, the only logical thing you can conclude is keep the feast of unleavened bread. I mean, there's no way you can twist that. Oh, he means keep Easter. No, that's not what he's talking about. It's quite clear when he said keep the feast. So if Paul is telling another Gentile church in the same time period keep the feast, he knew when that letter arrived in Corinth they were keeping the days of unleavened bread. How do you know that? Because he taught them to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And was ridiculed for it.
And as we close, I don't know how prophetic this is. It's hard to know how things fast and speed, but there is more indication that some major European leaders, the energy crisis, some of the sanctions America pushed, and they feel America does not want the war settled. We want the war to continue. And I think some of the Europeans are getting disillusioned with American leadership. Now, obviously, things will go up and down, but this could be the beginning of America's leadership of the West being, they're wondering, maybe America's not so leader-worthy. Is that the right word?
Reliable.
Yeah, reliable leader you want to follow.
That's by no accident either.
Nope.
Well, it looks like they're opening up an investigation on Hunter Biden's laptop and Joe's President Biden's affiliation with it too. So we may see more of that eke out over the next weeks and months ahead.
10% for the big
Also
guys.
heard yeah, the Democrats may be thinking about dumping Biden, but we'll see as well. But I heard at the G20 meeting, the Western Europeans had a meeting without the Americans, without Joe Biden, and he missed the big dinner.
He fell asleep.
And they also talked to China without America. Now, maybe that's just optics. It may not mean anything, but doesn't it kind of look like they're not following our leadership like they used to?
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, we don't have any right now. There's no leadership right now.
Well, we certainly don't demand respect. That's for sure.
Well, I want to thank everybody for showing up this evening, and thanks Dan and both Kens and all our audience.
All right. With that said,
Thank you guys. We enjoyed it.
oh yeah, always.
Thank
Yep.
you.
And we won't have a program next week. It'll be the week after next, right, Dr. Ricks?
December 2nd.
So our next time back is December 2nd, the Sabbath after Thanksgiving. So no, is it? Yeah.
The first Friday. Yeah, the first Friday after. The second Friday after Thanksgiving. Black Friday is going to do all the
That's
shopping
next
on the
week.
25th. But it's the week after that.
Yes.
So the
You're
week
right.
after Black Friday, we'll be back. But Ken has many great reruns up there that you can find on Google,
YouTube.
Right? YouTube.
Google YouTube, which they're both the
Thanks.
same thing, but Google,
Yeah.
YouTube is where you want to go. Or go to Rumble. Go to Rumble and look at our past programs. I'd rather you go there. So anyway, good night, everyone. Thanks for coming and watching us. And it looks like the whole system held together tonight. I think it's time for a new PC. But all right, everybody. Good night, and we'll see you back here again in 2 Sabbaths.
All right.
Good night.
We're happy you could make it, and so glad you are here, and hope that we've been able to make God's word more clear. Until next time, may God be with you in everything you try. But for now, till next week, we have to say goodbye.